She built her entire life around one thing: the truth. Not the Hollywood version of it, not the carefully managed PR version, but the actual, uncomfortable, peer-reviewed truth. She earned a real doctorate in neuroscience. She raised 2 children alone. She survived one of the most public career implosions in recent television history. And then, just when most people assumed her story was basically over, she did something that nobody saw coming. She told the truth about something that the rest of the world was too polished, too cautious, and too afraid of the backlash to say out loud. And it stopped people cold. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was real. This is the full story of Mayim Bialik, and why right now, in 2025, her name is back in every conversation that matters. There is a version of Mayim Bialik's life that looks, from the outside, like a cautionary tale. Child star rises, becomes famous, says something controversial, loses a major job, fades from relevance. That version is clean, easy to package, and almost entirely wrong. Because what actually happened to Mayim Bialik over the past 3 decades is something far more complicated and, in many ways, far more interesting. It is a story about what it costs to refuse to be quiet. About what happens when a person with genuine intellectual conviction steps into a culture that rewards performance over substance. And about what it looks like when someone rebuilds not by changing who they are, but by finally becoming more fully themselves. To understand where she is now, you have to start at the beginning. Mayim Bialik grew up in a household that took education seriously. Not in the casual, aspirational way that phrase usually gets used, but genuinely, seriously. She was the kind of child who read for the pleasure of understanding things, who asked questions that adults found inconvenient, who was drawn to the mechanics of how the world actually worked rather than the surface of how it appeared. When she started appearing on television as a young teenager, that quality did not disappear. People on set reportedly found her reading academic material between takes when most kids her age were doing anything but studying. The fame was real, but it never seemed to be the point for her. By the time she was a teenager starring in her own television series, the kind of visibility she had would have been more than enough for most people to ride indefinitely. But Mayim was already thinking about what came next, and what came next, for her, involved a laboratory. When she received acceptance letters from 2 of the most prestigious universities in the country, Harvard and Yale, she declined both of them. Not because she was not serious about her education, but because she had a different set of priorities. She wanted to remain in California, stay close to her family, and pursue both of the things she loved, science and performance, at the same time. She enrolled at UCLA, and what followed was not a casual, celebrity-adjacent educational experience. She went deep. She completed a doctorate in neuroscience in 2007, with her dissertation focused on hypothalamic activity in individuals with a complex genetic condition called Prader-Willi syndrome. This was serious academic work. The kind that requires years of dedication, precision, and intellectual rigor. She did it while the entertainment industry continued to move around her, and then she walked back onto a television set. When she joined The Big Bang Theory in 2010 as Amy Farrah Fowler, the obvious irony was not lost on anyone. A real neuroscientist playing a neuroscientist on one of the biggest shows on television. The role fit her in ways that went beyond the casting logic, and audiences responded. She received 4 Emmy nominations for the performance. For several years, she was among the most visible women on American television. But visibility, in Hollywood, is not a simple gift. It is also exposure. And the larger her platform grew, the more every opinion she expressed publicly became material for debate. In 2012, she published a parenting book that outlined her approach to attachment parenting, a philosophy that includes practices like extended breastfeeding, co-sleeping, and keeping young children physically close during their earliest years. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some readers found it thoughtful and grounded in genuine research. Others found it extreme and called it potentially harmful. The debate became loud and, at times, deeply personal. Mayim did not back down. She continued to defend her perspective in interviews and in writing, which only seemed to intensify the criticism. A pattern began to emerge. The same confidence that made people respect her also made her a target whenever she stepped into contested territory. Her intelligence, which had always been her most defining quality, was beginning to be read by certain corners of the public as arrogance. Her marriage ended in 2013. She and her husband had been together for nearly a decade, and the divorce became public news at a moment when she was already under significant professional scrutiny. She has spoken about the weight of navigating that experience privately while continuing to film, do press, and raise 2 young sons largely on her own. The exhaustion of that period, both personal and professional simultaneously, shaped something in her that would not fully surface publicly for years. She tried to manage the narrative as best she could. But narratives, once they begin forming in the public mind, develop their own momentum. Then came 2017, and the moment that changed the arc of her public reputation more than anything else. When the Harvey Weinstein story broke and the Me Too movement swept through Hollywood, Mayim wrote a personal essay for a major national publication. Her intention, by all available accounts, was sincere. She wrote about her own experience in the industry, about growing up as a young woman who did not fit conventional Hollywood standards of beauty, about feeling largely overlooked by the powerful men who were, as was becoming horrifyingly clear, preying on others. She wrote about personal choices she had made regarding how she dressed and how she moved through professional spaces, choices she credited with keeping her off certain radar. The response was swift, severe, and, for Mayim, clearly devastating. Readers and commentators across the country argued that her framing suggested women who had been targeted were somehow responsible for what happened to them. The word used over and over was victim blaming. She apologized. She clarified. She acknowledged that her words had caused real pain to people she had genuinely wanted to support. But the damage to her public reputation in certain circles was lasting in a way that apologies rarely fully repair. What made that particular wound so difficult was the context. She had spent her entire life building credibility through rigorous education and careful, evidence-based thinking. And in a single essay, written quickly in the middle of one of the most emotionally charged cultural moments in recent memory, that credibility took a hit it would not fully recover from in the short term. Articles from that period continued to resurface whenever her name came up. 4 years after, she carried the weight of a position she maintained she had never meant to take. The distance between intention and reception is something she has spoken about at length since then, and it is clear that the experience left a mark on how she thinks about the responsibility that comes with a public platform. The Jeopardy chapter arrived in 2021 and became its own complicated saga. After the beloved longtime host of the program passed away in late 2020, the production spent months in an extended guest hosting process that became an ongoing story in itself. When it was eventually announced that Mayim would share hosting duties on primetime specials and spin-offs, a significant portion of the show's longtime audience made clear, before she had filmed a single episode, that they did not want her there. Online petitions were organized. Every episode she hosted was dissected in detail: her delivery, her timing, her wardrobe, her interactions with contestants. Comparisons to her co-host were constant and, in most of the commentary, unflattering. Some of the criticism was legitimate. Live game show hosting is a genuinely specific and demanding skill, and she was learning it in public, which is one of the harder ways to develop any craft. But a substantial portion of the hostility felt less like a critique of her performance and more like a continuation of a longer cultural conversation about who she was and whether she deserved the platform she had. She hosted through 2022 and into 2023. Then the Writers Guild of America went on strike. Mayim made the decision to stop hosting in solidarity with the striking writers. It was a principled stand. It was also, practically speaking, a moment that gave the production a reason to reconsider her role. By the end of 2023, it was confirmed that her contract would not be renewed. The sole permanent hosting position would go to her co-host. She lost the job publicly, in a way that felt to many observers like a definitive closing of a door. But here is where the story takes a turn that most people did not anticipate, because Mayim Bialik did not respond to losing that door by scrambling to find another one exactly like it. She had launched a podcast in early 2021, while she was still hosting Jeopardy, and rather than treating it as a side project to be managed around a larger television career, she leaned into it fully after her contract ended. The podcast became something with genuine intellectual texture, a space for conversations with psychologists, researchers, and people navigating mental health challenges, all filtered through her background in neuroscience. It was not a celebrity interview show in the conventional sense. It had a specific point of view, and it attracted a specific kind of audience, people who wanted more than surface-level wellness content, who were looking for someone with actual scientific fluency to help them make sense of their own internal lives. She also began speaking about her own experience in ways she had not previously allowed herself to be public about. Episodes where she described her experience with depression, with the ongoing anxiety of being a single parent, with the long-term emotional residue of the op-ed controversy and its fallout, those were the ones that traveled furthest. People were not just paying attention to her because of a television role anymore. They were paying attention because she was articulating things that many of them had felt but had not heard expressed with that particular combination of honesty and scientific grounding. In 2022, she stepped behind the camera as the director of a film called As They Made Us. It was a quiet, emotionally heavy family drama about an adult daughter attempting to hold a fractured family together while processing grief and estrangement. The film did not become a blockbuster, but it confirmed something her supporters had been noting for a while. She had creative instincts and a storytelling perspective that went beyond interpreting other writers' material. The film was personal in ways that required no explanation for anyone paying attention to the arc of her life. What also became visible during this period was something more deliberate and more meaningful than simply staying busy. She was building a career structure that did not depend on any single network, any single producer, or any single platform's decision to keep her. The podcast was hers. The film was hers. The essays she was publishing were hers. After years of having her professional livelihood tied to the choices of people and institutions that could remove her at any moment, and had, that independence was not incidental. It was the entire architecture. She was constructing something that could not be cancelled in the way her previous opportunities had been. And then, in June of 2025, she published a personal essay in the Free Press that spread faster than almost anything she had written before. In it, she described what happened after her doctors recommended she try a low-dose GLP-1 medication, the same class of drugs that had become one of the dominant medical and cultural conversations of the era. Given her history with Graves' disease, an autoimmune condition affecting the thyroid, her medical team believed it was worth exploring. She agreed. What followed was not what any of them expected. She described a physical reaction that was severe and sustained, days of intense digestive distress, painful cramping, and an inability to keep down even small amounts of water. She described being essentially unable to function for stretches of time. For someone who had spent years studying the human body at a graduate academic level, and who had built a significant part of her public identity around science-backed thinking, the experience carried a particular weight. It was not just physically brutal. It shook her confidence in a framework she had trusted, but what made the essay genuinely spread was not the physical detail. It was the argument she was making beneath it. She was not writing to discourage people from these medications. She was careful and explicit in acknowledging that GLP-1 drugs have provided real benefit for a large number of people. What she was pointing to was a gap in the broader public conversation, a space where adverse experiences were being quietly crowded out by the volume of success stories. She was saying that when a medical treatment becomes a cultural phenomenon, the people for whom it does not work, or for whom it causes serious harm, tend to become invisible. And she was offering herself as evidence that this invisibility has real consequences for real people. For her audience, the essay landed with unusual force. Because this was not a celebrity with a vague wellness brand expressing a vague concern. This was someone with a doctorate in neuroscience, someone who had spent her adult life as a credentialed defender of scientific rigor, saying that the scientific and medical conversation around these treatments had developed a blind spot. That is a different kind of statement. And people heard it differently. There is a through line in Mayim Bialik's story that becomes visible only when you look at the full arc, not just the individual chapters. Every significant professional difficulty she has faced, the parenting controversy, the op-ed fallout, the Jeopardy criticism, the GLP-1 essay, and whatever response it generates, has come directly from the same source as her credibility. Her refusal to soften what she actually thinks in order to make it easier for people to receive. Her willingness to say the precise thing she believes rather than the approximate, safer version of it. That quality has cost her real money, real opportunities, and real portions of her public reputation. It has also built something that most public figures who play it carefully never accumulate: a genuinely loyal audience that trusts her not because she is always right, but because she is consistently transparent about her reasoning. When she gets something wrong, she says so and explains her thinking. When her own experience contradicts a position she has held publicly, she puts that on the table too. She rebuilt that audience in her 40s, with a public record of controversies that anyone could retrieve in seconds. That is a meaningfully different kind of risk than starting over when you are young and unknown. Beginning again when the whole internet remembers your worst moments requires a particular form of courage that does not get discussed enough. She has been open about the role that therapy played in making that possible, not in the vague, inspirational way the topic often gets treated publicly, but specifically, describing the cognitive work involved in separating her sense of self-worth from the fluctuations of public reception. For someone whose identity had been so thoroughly built around being perceived as intelligent and credible, having that perception publicly damaged was not a small thing to move through T49. Mayim Bialik is not attempting to recapture a previous version of her career. She is not trying to recreate the recognition that came with a long-running network sitcom. She is not pursuing another high-profile hosting role as a way of proving something to the people who said she was not right for the last one. She is writing essays that make people stop what they are doing and read. She is directing films about the kinds of family experiences that do not resolve into clean, hopeful endings. She is hosting conversations about the aspects of mental health and neuroscience that the mainstream entertainment industry continues to avoid. She is doing, in other words, exactly what she has always done, following her genuine curiosity in public and letting the audience find her, rather than performing a version of herself designed to attract one. Whether any particular viewer agrees with her on any specific issue is almost beside the point. What she has built is a coherent public identity grounded in authentic conviction, and that, in a media environment saturated with performed authenticity, is a genuinely rare thing. It took her the better part of 3 decades, a divorce, a public scandal that stuck to her longer than it should have, a high-profile job loss, and a medical experience that shook her foundational assumptions about her own body to arrive at it. But the transformation is real. And once you see it clearly, it does not look like a comeback story. It looks like someone finally, fully becoming themselves.